Today on Greater Boston, there's no shortage of books or movies about the Holocaust, but a new three-part documentary series brings a look at this nation's role like no other.
We tell ourselves stories as a nation. One of the stories we tell ourselves is that we're a land of immigrants. But in moments of crisis, it becomes very hard for us to live up to those stories.
The primary goal is to get to the United States.
But the golden door was not wide open.
We're challenged as Americans to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done.
In our better moments, we are very good people, but that's not all there is to the story.
The series is The U.S. and the Holocaust from co-directors Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein. It premiered on PBS last month. Filmmaker Ken Burns recently joined me. Ken, good to see you. Thanks so much. You know, Ken, the film is called U.S. and the Holocaust. In my house, we call it What I Thought I Knew About the Holocaust, but Did Not. You know, at the top of the list is I always assumed that we did so little to help Jews in Europe because we knew so little. But that wasn't true, was it?
No, not at all. We knew from the very beginning what was going on, or pretty close after that. And unfortunately, this whole thing takes place, the lead up to the Holocaust, and the Holocaust at a particularly kind of toxic brew in American history, where there's rampant anti-Semitism right out in the open. One of the best known radio personalities, the sort of Rush Limbaugh of the day, is spouting anti-Jewish vile. Henry Ford has taken over a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, is reproducing the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, this horrific Russian hoax, anti-Semitic text that you can still find online as the Bible of the anti-Semites. There's lots of worries about jobs. It's the Depression. There's an anti-immigrant sentiment, which has made minuscule quotas for those countries where the mostly Jews and Catholics are. There's the replacement stuff. There's the Protestant majority that is worried they're going to replace. There's age-old American racism. You throw into that eugenics, this pseudoscience that says that there can be a hierarchy of races. There's only one race, as you know, Jim, the human race. And this is the fuel for the fire that makes it impossible for us to we let in more than any, look, let's just set it straight. We're not responsible for the Holocaust. We didn't do it. And we let in more than any other sovereign nation, but we could have done at least 5 times that many people. And I still think it wouldn't have been enough. I still think we'd get a failing grade.
You know, even when we did know, well, let's go back. Late in the game, in 1944, 3 men who escaped from Auschwitz were responsible for the Auschwitz report. Let's hear a little bit about that.
It contained first-hand testimony from 3 men who had managed to escape from Auschwitz, and provided meticulous details of what they had seen there.
76% of Americans by that time believe that it's happening, but then they're asked the numbers. How many Jews do you think have been killed? And Americans cannot grasp the scale and the scope of the crime. It's only 1 in 5 Americans believe that it's more than 1 million Jews who have been murdered. And by that point, it's more than 5 million.
And Ken Burns, even when we did know what we know, even if we were in some sort of willful ignorance about the full numbers, we still didn't act. Why?
Yeah, we didn't.
Why?
I don't know. It's such a complex ingredient of factors, Jim. A lot of it, we follow the polling, and Daniel Green, the scholar there, was really good. Even when bad stuff was happening, Kristallnacht, people say, oh, this is really bad, this shouldn't happen. But maybe the Jews brought it upon themselves. So there's a kind of undertow. When everything was done, forget about guys getting out, showing little drawn maps of Auschwitz. When you've got the photographs of the liberated concentration camps in Germany, right? And it's just there with the crematoria and all of that sort of stuff. Only 5% of Americans want to let in refugees. And so there's a sense of which we are as true psychologically as it is in any sort of, we're both things. We're the land of immigrants. We're what the Statue of Liberty stand for in the Emma Lazarus poem, but we're also not. A guy wrote, who was the editor of the Atlantic magazine, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, a poem that's, right after her and says, oh, white goddess, oh, liberty, white goddess, is it best to leave the gates unguarded? So you have these tendencies in American history, and we try to sort of shoot the gap and pretend the bad stuff didn't happen or isn't as big as it was, or it was just been, we tamped it down for a while. Every once in a while it comes back up. It's there. It's there. And I think that's one of the things that struck me. I mean, for us as filmmakers, it's the same as your household, right? It's like, wow, I had no idea.
When I saw that 5% number on your screen, I rewound the thing because I was convinced that I hadn't heard it properly.
Right.
You mentioned eugenics a couple of minutes ago. I mentioned to you when you and Lynn Novick were kind enough to join Marjorie Egan and me on the radio that thanks to you, I think less of Teddy Roosevelt and more of Franklin Roosevelt. Could you describe this Teddy Roosevelt eugenics connection thing?
Well, he's part of a Protestant establishment that, believes in manifest destiny, meaning let's get rid of the Indians, however that happens, however unfortunate, it's a necessity of time. We are the superior race. We have a kind of noblesse oblige. It's called the white man's burden. We have to carry that around the world. He would be, a colonialist for sure if we'd had the kind of empire. And in fact, we do. He inherits from the Spanish-American War, Cuba, and particularly the Philippines, where, we have pictures of waterboarding from 1902, American soldiers waterboarding Filipino thing. I mean, he's terrific in so many ways, personality-wise and otherwise, but you can't sugarcoat him anymore. You can't sugarcoat Charles Lindbergh, and you can't sugarcoat Helen Keller for crying out loud.
Wait, stop for a second. Helen Keller was part of the eugenics movement?
So you remember when the Affordable Care Act was, all the hoopla about what is called Obamacare, and there was all this right-wing stuff about how they're going to be death panels. Helen Keller has a quote in our film. We use an actress reading her words. That's basically proposing that there should be a group of qualified people who shall determine if this deformed or mentally ill, or whatever the term was, feeble-minded was the term that eugenics used a lot, baby should be put to death or not.
You also mentioned the anti-Semitism in very high and powerful places. Henry Ford was not just an incredible industrialist, but I guess I use the term loosely journalist. Here's a little piece about Ford's role that you described a minute ago.
The automobile pioneer Henry Ford blamed Jews for everything from Lincoln's assassination to the change he thought he detected in the flavor of his favorite candy bar. He bought himself a weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and used it to spread his anti-Semitic propaganda. The articles were eventually reprinted in 4 volumes and translated into 9 languages, including German.
How powerful were those voices, the Lindberghs and the Fords and all those guys?
It was huge. I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we try to understate it and say, oh, well, it's just a few people. It's not. It's across the board. Avery Brundage, who's the head of the Olympic Committee, the chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck. I mean, it is a general feeling. I mean, I think Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt inherited it too, but you couldn't really go very far in an immigrant New York State if you're going to hold on to these ancient and sort of knee-jerk prejudices. And that's what makes them, I think, superior, is that they outgrow the specific gravity of their, whatever prejudices they inherit when they're growing up. I don't think Teddy Roosevelt did. And that, to me, is a demerit to him. He's wonderful in conservation. He's wonderful in national parks and all of that sort of stuff. And he's wonderful in understanding the role that the federal government has to have, a kind of countervailing balance between labor and capital, between the robber barons and a burgeoning labor movement. And he thinks that government should play a much bigger role in the lives of people. And that I agree with. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt takes it to the next level because of the ravages of the Depression. But it's it's scary when you get into some of these theories. So the Dearborn Independent, Jim, had the second largest circulation of any newspaper in the United States. We're not talking about fringe stuff.
So not only were the Fords and Lindberghs allies, as you point out in the film, Jim Crow laws were seen by German jurists as a model for what the Germans intended to do to the Jews. You know, I said this to you before, Ken, when we talked about this. The most powerful part of this film to me, and I think the reason it'll stay with people, are not just the numbers and the big picture, but it's the smallest of pictures. The individual stories of one human being or one family. Can you pick one of those that stayed with you and share that with us?
Yeah, no, I think that you're exactly right, Jim. I think in a big picture like this, the word 6 million gets to be opaque. You don't know what it means. And the writer Daniel Mendelsohn in our film says you have to particularize, you have to make each one of those 6 million a person whose life is as important as yours is to you and mine is to me. And that's really a hard thing to do, but we tried to do it. And so we have several survivors, several stories we tell, and we're dotted with lots of heroes. A writer, Varian Fry, who didn't have to leave the comfort of the New York literary world, but did, with money strapped to his leg to save Jews in southern France. You have John Paley, a bureaucrat in Treasury, who's fighting the anti-Semitic bureaucrats in State Department to try to create the War Refugee Board, and does, which saves more human beings than any other thing, very late in the game. But you also have people like Eva Geiringer, who's an Austrian Jew. She's in Vienna. She and her family leave early as soon as the Anschluss happens, Hitler taking over Austria, and goes to Amsterdam and ends up in the same sort of block as the Frank family, which is left many years later. That would be Otto and his wife Edith and their daughters Margot and Anne. And Eva and Anne become friends, and everybody's all captured, as everyone knows, and everybody goes off to Auschwitz. Not just the four of the Frank family, but the four father, mother, son, and brother to Auschwitz. And her survival in Auschwitz, it was something where we just assumed we would be, taking our archival skills out to their biggest. We didn't need to. We had a Polish crew. It was the middle of COVID. They went and took some footage, beautiful footage with drones and other things of Auschwitz, and let Eva, one person, tell you what it was like to be there, tell you what it was like to hear the sounds dying away and the fighting dying away. And then all of a sudden coming across a guy she thought was a bear, a Russian soldier. And he's, means she's going to live, and this is the whole point,
Well, some of them also tell beautiful stories about lives that were not fully lived, that just are.
This is what my whole point is, I think. And my whole reason that I think I grew up in some ways working on this. I think it opened my heart in another way, Jim, that's hard to really describe, other than to say that if you try to do the incalculable task of making particular these individuals, it is incredibly painful. But then you realize they're the amputated limb that we still feel, and we don't know what cures for diseases weren't discovered, what symphonies weren't written, what gardens weren't tended, what children weren't brought up with love. And that hurts. And it has to hurt all of us, because for so long, the United States has had that kind of, we got an ocean and a continent we didn't really know, and we're the land of the free, and people came here and escaped this. And that's true. But then the other side of not wanting people is equally as true. And that's something that we ought to come to terms with, and might help us in the perspective that we desperately need today.
Couldn't agree more. Speaking of today, I know you started making this film before Trump's ascension, but it is impossible to watch this film without one piece of your brain hearing the former president say they're very fine people, chanting Jews will not replace us. There's that. There's the anti-immigrant animus. There's the attacks on democracy. Once he ascended, again, I know you started making this in 2015. Before he did, how hard was it for you to put him out of your head?
Well, that's our job. There's never been a film we've worked on anyone in which it doesn't rhyme, as Mark Twain might say, in the present. So you're aware of that. What happened to us is that we were just so aware that where it was in 2015 when we started rhyming, every 6 sentences, now it's rhyming every other sentence. And by the time we're finished, it's every sentence. So all it did is required us to have a dismount that acknowledges that these echoes can meet, the past can meet the present, and they can come. That we felt responsible to do without narration, untethered from our usual sort of narrative control. The last event happens in 1965, but there's a couple of minutes that leads us up that acknowledges it. Deborah Lipstadt says in the film, she's the great Holocaust scholar and historian, and she says the time to stop a genocide is before it happens. And I realized when we were done, I thought that maybe we could add to a conversation, Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein and I, and Jeffrey Ward, the writer, by saying that the time to save a democracy is before it's lost.
You know, one of my daughters who was watching this with me said this should be shown to every single school kid. And when she said it, I nodded in agreement. And then I thought about critical race theory, though systemic racism is part of American society. And we can't teach that because it makes white kids feel guilty. Well, systemic anti-Semitism, you demonstrated, has long been part of American society. So should we assume, and I mean this sincerely, that governors in certain states are going to say, we can't show the U.S. and the Holocaust to our school kids either?
I hope not. I think what happens is that the loudest things, the most outrageous stuff gets all of our attention. I had a wonderful Zoom. I wish you'd been on. It would have ameliorated some of your anxiety. 5,000 teachers who are looking forward to teaching this. And we are working with the Holocaust Museum, who was our partner throughout this. And they know how to teach the Holocaust, and they know how to teach it delicately, state to state, region to region, law to law, that sort of stuff. And at the same time, I've spent my entire life with PBS, making films for PBS, which knows how to reach every classroom in the country. So we've developed lesson plans, and this is not about, as Daniel Green again says at the beginning, this is not about wagging our finger and making people feel bad. This is literally about, we have to know a complicated history. It's so funny that over in history, you can't say a bad thing, but over in sports, the coach gets to yell at you because you haven't done this right and you haven't done that right. And we'd fire that coach if they weren't directly honest to this. We have to be, if we are as exceptional as we think we are, then we have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards. And when we've screwed up and when we haven't been our best selves, we have to be able to answer to that and to tell our children about it. And can I tell you, this period that the U.S. and the Holocaust covers, we weren't our best selves in regard to getting Jewish refugees in general, out of harm's way until it was too late.
You know, Ken, before you go, speaking of knowing your history, I thought one piece of the history that I knew thoroughly was the history of Anne Frank. And you open your film with it, and I was sort of surprised. I think like a lot of people were, but I learned a lot, including what Otto Frank, her father, was trying to do during this travail. What was that?
Well, you know, all of us come to the Holocaust, most of us, most American school kids come to the Holocaust studies through the diary of Anne Frank. And we've got that plausible deniability, again, an ocean away, many countries away, didn't happen to us. Isn't this a sad story? Isn't it beautiful, right? But what we're now learning and have just been revealed in the time we were working on it in discoveries in Otto Frank's papers is that he was working assiduously to try to get to the United States. And let's just stop. Like, he's not one of 3.3 million Polish Jews with very few contacts in the United States. He's well connected. He knows rich people. He's got means. He's a good businessman. He's dotted every I and crossed every T. He's got contacts that have contacts in the Roosevelt administration, and he still can't get a visa for his family. He still can't get a visa for his family. And I don't want to be counterfactual, but just say to your daughter or to yourself, what happens if we have Anne Frank over here, right?
Well, we didn't have Anne Frank over here, and as you go, you mentioned Eva Geiringer, is that how you say her last name again? Grew up same age, friendly with Anne Frank. After Auschwitz is liberated, correct me if I'm wrong, she and her mother go to find their father and I think siblings and are unsuccessful, but they do come upon Otto Frank, who they obviously knew. And what's the end of that story, Ken Burns?
Well, he's desperate to find out where his wife and daughters were, and they hadn't seen them. But he had seen their father and son, and they turned out to be lost. And the daughters obviously are lost, and the wife are lost. And we found out the particulars many months later. He did, and he then he's given the diary, and he doesn't know what to do. But in the end, Eva's mother Fritzi and Otto are married, and there's something so You know, Jim, it's so beautiful when you can find like a ray of light on a really dismally rainy day. And this film is got a lot of rays of light, but there's none more poignant, I think it seems to me, than perhaps there is a Jewish army captain from the U.S. who is at Buchenwald, and he holds the first, you know, service there in Hebrew and sings it and speaks to them as a representative of the United States Army, as a member of the Jewish Committee. And there are people in the audience that are GEIs and they're survivors, and they're standing there gaunt and they're hearing Hebrew that they haven't heard in an awfully long time. And it's, you know, those moments are the ones that you just realize that, you know, we know what the signposts are. We know where the good behavior is. We know how to be good people. It's just getting there gives me a lot of stuff to make films about.
6 of the most important hours I've ever spent, thanks to you and your colleagues. Ken Burns, I really appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you too.
All 3 parts of the U.S. and the Holocaust are available to watch now at pbs.org and on the PBS video app.